Hello and welcome to Talking Books. I'm Jill de Villiers. A controversial book is the topic of our discussion today. It examines a dark time in the life of Mother of the Nation, Winnie Mandela. Those of us who were around in the 1990s still remember the trial around the murder of Stompie Moeketsi, which ended in a suspended sentence for her. This book looks back to the time and tells us the story from a different perspective. It is called Truth, Lies and Alibis, a Winnie Mandela story, and the writer is veteran British journalist Fred Bridgland. Fred, thank you so much for joining us. So glad to be able to speak to you about this. Reading the book, I sort of had a vision of, you know, those American whodunits where the detective stands in front of a huge wall of pictures and names and stuff, and he tries to put it together. Sure. This is very much how I saw you standing in front of this. Would that be wrong?
I've never heard it described that way, but it's certainly what the process has been. I mean, there's a lot of evidence from other people, a lot of evidence I've gathered myself personally. But it's come from all over the place, and it was a jumble, and I had to reassess all of it. It's been rather like disentangling a Rubik's Cube.
Now I'm going to look at that wall as well and look at some of the names in the puzzle, and if you can talk around those names, I'd appreciate it very much. So. Names like Mandela, John Morgan, Father Paul Verlaine, Katiza Tebakulu, the football club, and on the sidelines, Jimmy Richardson.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
Can you tell me about that?
Which ones do you want me to begin with?
Talk about where would you begin with these names?
I'd begin with John Morgan, because it was John Morgan really who spiked Winnie Mandela's alibi. Or he spiked it initially, and you remember her alibi for not being present in Soweto when Stompie Moeketsi was severely beaten and ended up dead. She was 250 miles away in Brandfort.
And this happened at the back of her house, didn't it?
That's right. But he was her driver, and he gave an interview to a very fine journalist in this country, Dawn Barkhuizen, and she had gone into Soweto on a completely different story than the Winnie Mandela story, and she saw Morgan, and she knew him, and he eventually talked to her, and he was taken to a series of hotels for 2 days at a time, and he spilled out to Dawn Barkhuizen how he had lied at Winnie's trial, saying she was in Brandfort when all the time she was in Soweto. And he said that in his interviews with Barkhuizen and subsequently on television in South Africa, that Winnie Mandela, after Stompie had been killed next to the jacuzzi behind her house, Winnie had ordered him to take the dog away. And Morgan said he refused to do that. And he said he had lied. He lied at the trial because he and others had been ordered by Winnie Mandela and her lieutenants, including Mr. Dalian Polfo, to lie on her behalf and say she was in Brandfort and therefore could not have been involved in the beating of Stompie Moeketsi.
But when you get a mythical person, a legendary person like Winnie Mandela, because I remember looking at the trial and looking at her walking up to the court, and this incredibly beautiful woman, this incredibly powerful woman walking up there, and I think most people would have wanted to believe that she could not possibly have done something like that. What is the difference between how people perceive a person of that stature and that beauty and an ordinary person on the street?
It's very difficult for ordinary people. People need heroes, they need heroines, they need icons, and Winnie Mandela was undoubtedly an icon. She had suffered terribly under the former nationalist government. She'd been imprisoned for a long period, and she was in solitary confinement for 160 days. And then she was banished to Brandfort for 7 or 8 years. So she was treated incredibly cruelly, and in the context of South African history and all your racial troubles, then clearly she was a hero. But the people I talked to were little and unimportant people who had suffered at her hands. And the more I got into the research for this, and I got into it by accident rather than by design, the more interested I became in those little and unimportant people than in Winnie Mandela herself. And this book is really, although it's got Winnie Mandela in the title, it's less about her than about the people who suffered at the hands of the football club.
Now, one of those little people who suffered at the hands of the football club, Stompie Moeketsi, what is it that this little person had known or was privy to that was so dangerous to them that caused them to want to take him off the face of the earth?
You know, my initial reaction to that question is, God knows. I mean, I don't fully understand it myself to this day, but somehow Winnie had got the impression. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. Stompie was being given shelter by a white minister in Soweto, the Reverend Paul Verheyen, who was very popular in Soweto, and somehow it got into Winnie's head that the white minister must be sodomizing all these boys who sought shelter in the minister's house. And she also got it into her head that they were perhaps working for the police. So she sent a gang to kidnap 4 boys, Stompie and 3 others, and they were brought to her house. And I've conducted several interviews with the people who were beaten and who were there, and she was trying to get Stompie to confess that he'd been sodomized by Paul Verheyen and that he was a police informer. And Stompie all the time, according to accounts, said, no, he did nothing to me. And then eventually, at some point, all the boys began confessing to having been sodomized by Paul Verheyen. But I've interviewed them at length, and they said, we did it because the beatings were getting so serious, we had to do something to stop them. And then Stompie, at some point, his injuries became so serious that Mrs. Mandela sent for her personal doctor, Dr. Abu Bakr Asfat, to come and treat him. And Abu Bakr Asfat said to Winnie, look, he's so seriously injured that I can't do anything, you've got to get him to hospital. And part of the development of the book shows how Abu Bakr Asfat had to be killed as well as Stompie. And he was assassinated by 2 Zulu youths who said they had been hired by Mrs. Mandela and given a gun by Mrs. Mandela to shoot Dr. Asfat. It's a tangled tale.
So then Attorney General Klaus von Leres decided to start a case, but it wasn't. Nobody really wanted it to happen. It was wanted to squash it. Who was it who really wanted to squash this case?
I think Nelson Mandela, certainly, and probably President F.W. de Klerk. The F.W. de Klerk and senior levels of the National Party government were very concerned about Nelson's mental well-being if his wife was tried and she went to prison. And you've got to, it's not, I'm teaching you to suck eggs, so you've got to remember that negotiations were at a critical stage between the Nats and the ANC about the future of South Africa. So really the elite in the ANC and the elite in the National Party government, none of them wanted Winnie Mandela in prison where she would become a martyr to the cause.
So the end of this was there was actually a case, but she received a suspended sentence for 6 years. And then this was followed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Just one thing, the sentence initially was not suspended. It was a sentence of 6 years.
Okay, and then it was on appeal.
On appeal, it was reduced to a small fine.
Okay. And then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came. Did anything more come out of that than the case itself?
Oh, huge. Volumes of it. For a start, Katiza Chebukulu, who I had first found in a prison in Zambia, where he had been put by an ANC Special Operations Unit, and they'd asked Kenneth Kaunda, the president of Zambia, to put Katiza Chebukulu in prison without charge or trial, and it seems he was meant to die there, but by a sort of combination of luck and journalistic enterprise, I found him and got him out of prison. And he and I forget the original question now, but remind me, but I'll carry on. And he told me and many other people that he had seen Winnie stab Stompie Moeketsi behind her jacuzzi in her home in Soweto. And at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he repeated this story, and he stood up and he demonstrated how he had seen her stabbing Stompie next to the jacuzzi.
Okay, just in conclusion, for idealistic people, young people today, who believe in justice and in the law, when something like that happens, what do you tell them?
I think you mustn't be naive about people in power. And I think you have to realize that the truth is very rarely pure, and it's never simple. And you must ask big questions of all our great leaders, not just in Africa, but in Europe, in my country, elsewhere. Be vigilant and dig for the truth.
Fred Bridgland, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us about your book. And the book is called Truth, Lies and Alibis, a Winnie Mandela story. And that was it for this edition of Talking Books. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.